A Rottweiler saves a stranded traveler in a snowstorm. What happens next will amaze you. The snowstorm was relentless, a fierce white fury that turned the serene mountain landscape into a menacing, icy prison. Winds howled through the dense pines, their branches sagging under the weight of snow creaking ominously. The world seemed swallowed by the storm, visibility reduced to mere feet. Amid this chaos, a lone figure trudged forward, each step a monumental effort against the bitter cold and the deepening drifts. Jackson had set out early that morning, an experienced hiker confident in his knowledge of the terrain. The forecast had warned of light snow, but this was something else entirely. The storm had rolled in with a vengeance, faster and fiercer than anyone had anticipated. Now he was lost, disoriented in a world transformed by the blizzard. His breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the frigid air. The biting cold seeped through his layers, chilling him to the bone. He clutched his jacket tighter around him, his gloved hands trembling. Every sound was muffled by the wind, every step seemed to sink deeper into the snow. He paused, leaning against a tree to catch his breath, his mind racing with thoughts of survival. Suddenly, through the swirling snow, a shape emerged. At first, Jackson thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the storm. But as it drew closer, he could make out the form of a dog, large, muscular, with a sleek black coat that stood in stark contrast to the white around it. The dog's eyes were sharp and intelligent, scanning Jackson with an intensity that seemed almost human. It was a Rottweiler, a breed known for its strength and loyalty. Jackson felt a flicker of hope stir within him. Where there was a dog, there might be shelter, help, or at least a companion to share this harrowing ordeal. The Rottweiler approached cautiously, its paws crunching softly in the snow. It stopped, a few feet away, studying him. "Hey, buddy," Jackson croaked, his voice hoarse from the cold and exhaustion. "Where did you come from?" The dog tilted its head, ears pricking up at the sound of his voice. It stepped closer, tail wagging slightly, a sign of friendliness. Jackson knelt, extending a hand. The Rottweiler sniffed it, then gave a brief affirmative bark. "Good boy," Jackson murmured, feeling a surge of relief. He reached out, scratching behind the dog's ears. The warmth of the animal was a small comfort against the encroaching cold. Looking around, Jackson realized he couldn't stay out here much longer. He needed to find shelter, and fast. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and nightfall would only bring colder temperatures. He glanced back at the dog, who seemed to be waiting for something. "Do you know the way?" Jackson asked, more to himself than to the dog. To his surprise, the Rottweiler barked again and began walking, looking back as if urging him to follow. With no other options, Jackson decided to trust the dog. He followed, his steps shaky but determined. The Rottweiler moved with confidence, as though it knew exactly where it was going. They wound their way through the trees, the dog's presence a reassuring beacon in the storm. The journey was grueling. The wind cut through Jackson's clothing and his legs felt like lead, each step an ordeal. But the dog kept him going, its unwavering determination spurring him forward. Time seemed to blur in the blizzard, the world reduced to the immediate struggle for survival. After what felt like hours, the dog suddenly stopped. Jackson looked up, his heart sinking at first when he saw nothing but more snow and trees. But then he noticed a subtle change, a faint outline of a structure against the white backdrop. It was a small cabin, barely visible through the snow, but unmistakably there. Jackson felt a surge of hope. He stumbled forward, the dog trotting beside him. Reaching the cabin, he pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly. Inside the cabin was a stark contrast to the storm outside. It was small but sturdy, with a single room dominated by a stone fireplace. A stack of wood sat nearby, and an old worn rug covered the wooden floor. The air was cold but sheltered from the biting wind. Jackson wasted no time. He set about lighting a fire, his hands fumbling with the matches. The Rottweiler watched him, sitting patiently by the door. After a few tries, the fire caught, and warmth began to fill the room. Jackson collapsed onto the rug, exhaustion overtaking him. "Thank you," he whispered, looking at the dog. "You saved my life." The Rottweiler wagged its tail, settling down beside him. For the first time in hours, Jackson felt a sense of safety. The storm raged on outside, but in this small cabin there was warmth, shelter, and the unspoken bond between man and dog, a bond forged in the crucible of survival. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Jackson's thoughts drifted. He wondered about the dog's story, how it had come to be out there in the storm, but for now he was grateful. Grateful for the unexpected companionship and the second chance at life this Rottweiler had given him. And as sleep finally claimed him, Jackson knew that this was only the beginning of their journey together. What lay ahead would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But in that moment, in the heart of the storm, they had found each other. And that, he thought, was the start of something extraordinary. Before the storm, Jackson was a man, with a routine, a life defined by structure and predictability. He had always been the type of person who craved control, who thrived in the certainty of a well-planned day. As a journalist, he was used to deadlines, schedules, and the rush of finding stories that captivated readers. His life was a blend of interviews, research, and a constant stream of emails. But behind the deadlines, he harbored a love for the wild, nature's untamed beauty, the kind of beauty that couldn't be captured by words alone. Hiking had always been his escape, a way to disconnect from the noise of the world and reconnect with himself. Jackson's cabin, a small but cozy retreat nestled on the outskirts of the mountains, was his sanctuary. It sat on a steep hill, surrounded by thick forests of pine and fir trees. The isolation was exactly what he sought when he needed to clear his mind. It was here that he could forget about the world's demands and immerse himself in the quiet solace of nature. The cabin had been his father's before him, a place where Jackson had spent summers as a child, learning to fish, to hike, to survive. His father had passed away years ago, and the cabin had become a silent tribute to him. It was more than just wood and stone. It held memories of the days when Jackson's father had taught him everything about the mountains. They would sit by the fire at night, sharing stories while the wind howled outside, always louder than their voices. Those were the days that Jackson missed the most, now that life had pulled him in so many different directions. That morning, before the storm arrived, Jackson had been sitting on the porch of the cabin, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. The sun was rising, casting a golden light over the mountains, and for a moment everything felt perfectly still. The world was at peace. He had planned to hike a trail he hadn't visited in years, a trail that led to a secluded spot by a river, a place where he used to go with his father. It was his favorite part of the mountain, a place where time seemed to slow down. But Jackson had been feeling a strange sense of unease in the days leading up to this trip, a nagging feeling he couldn't quite shake, like something was about to change. He had thought it was just the stress from his job, or perhaps the fact that he hadn't been back to the mountains in so long. But now, as he sat on the porch, feeling the cool morning air, he tried to push the thought away. It was just a passing feeling, he told himself. The hike had started off as it always did, with the crisp air biting at his cheeks and the soft crunch of leaves beneath his boots. He had fallen into the rhythm of the walk, his mind wandering to the articles he needed to write, the calls he needed to return. But as the trail twisted higher into the mountains, the unease began to grow. The clouds had begun to gather, dark and heavy, and Jackson had felt a chill in the air that didn't belong. Still, he pressed on, not wanting to turn back. His father's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him that the mountains could change quickly, but they were also a place where a man learned his true strength. Jackson had always prided himself on being resourceful, prepared for anything. He carried a sturdy backpack, a map, and a first aid kit. He had weathered storms before, both literal and metaphorical. What could possibly go wrong? But as the snow started to fall, heavier and faster than expected, Jackson's confidence began to waver. The trail, once clear and well-trodden, became obscured under a blanket of white. The landscape that had once been so familiar to him now seemed foreign, a world turned upside down by the storm's fury. His footsteps grew heavier, his pace slowing as the snow piled higher. By the time he realized he was lost, it was too late. The storm had swallowed him whole, disorienting him completely. Panic started to creep in, a feeling he had never experienced before in these mountains. He could feel his heart racing, his breath short as the temperature dropped. The wind howled through the trees, a menacing reminder of nature's power. His world had shrunk to nothing more than the crunch of snow beneath his boots and the oppressive whiteness surrounding him. In that moment, Jackson understood something that had eluded him all his life. No matter how much control we think we have, the natural world, its storms, its wildness, is a force beyond human understanding. And yet, it was the very thing he had sought for years, the beauty of nature that seemed so peaceful on the surface, but harbored the most unpredictable and dangerous of forces. He had pushed on because he thought he could conquer it all. But in the storm, Jackson realized just how vulnerable he was. As the wind picked up again, biting at his face and numbing his fingers, he searched for any sign of civilization, any hint of shelter. But the world around him had become a whiteout, a vast empty expanse where nothing could be distinguished from anything else. It was in this moment, more than any other, that Jackson truly understood the concept of being lost, not just in the physical sense, but in a deeper, more existential way. But despite the fear clawing at him, despite the growing sense of panic, there was a small flicker of hope. The dog had appeared, a beacon in the storm, guiding him toward survival when everything seemed lost. As Jackson huddled by the fire in the cabin, the warmth slowly returning to his frozen limbs, his thoughts began to settle. The storm raged on. Outside, but here in the small cabin, he was safe. He thought back to the beginning of the day, when everything had seemed so ordinary. Now, with the fire crackling beside him and the dog lying by his side, he realized just how unpredictable life could be. The storm had been an unexpected force, but it had brought him something more valuable than he could have ever anticipated. A companion, an unlikely savior who had shown him that sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. The dog's quiet loyalty, its silent determination to lead him to safety, was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there could be light, there could be hope. Jackson smiled down at the Rottweiler, its large, intelligent eyes looking back at him with quiet understanding. The storm outside may have been violent, but in this cabin, with the dog by his side, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. As the hours passed, Jackson drifted into a deep sleep, the warmth of the fire and the rhythmic sound of the dog's breathing beside him, lulling him into a sense of calm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome, but for tonight, he was safe. And that was enough. The storm outside seemed to intensify with each passing minute, as if nature itself had set its sights on breaking Jackson's resolve. The wind screamed against the cabin's walls, the snow battering the small building as though trying to tear it apart. Inside, the fire crackled, a faint warmth providing an oasis of comfort in the midst of the raging blizzard. Jackson sat in front of the hearth, still shaken from the harrowing hike that had brought him to this point. His mind replayed every moment, how the storm had suddenly come upon him, how he had realized too late that he was lost, and how the Rottweiler had appeared just when he had almost given up hope. But as the night deepened, a new feeling began to settle in, one that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. It wasn't fear, but something worse: uncertainty. Jackson knew that the storm outside wasn't just a passing inconvenience. It was a force that could hold him captive for days, even weeks, if it didn't let up soon. And that would leave him in a precarious situation. He could feel the weight of the realization pressing down on him, like the weight of the storm itself. The Rottweiler, lying quietly on the rug beside him, had shown him the way here, but could it guide him out? Could the dog lead him back to civilization, back to safety? Or had he made a critical mistake by leaving the trail in the first place? He tried to ignore the creeping panic. Instead, he focused on the present, his immediate surroundings. The fire was still crackling, the only source of heat in the cabin. But the temperature was dropping, and even though the warmth from the fire was comforting, it wasn't enough to ward off the chill of isolation creeping into his bones. The howling wind outside seemed to mock him, reminding him that the storm was far from over. Jackson stood up and stretched his stiff limbs. His legs were sore from the hike, his body protesting the effort of moving after hours of immobility. As he moved to the window, He peered out through the frost-covered glass, straining to see anything beyond the swirling white curtain of snow. All he could make out were vague shapes, trees, rocks, and the ever-present snowstorm that had consumed the landscape. Nothing but white. Nothing but the storm. He turned away from the window, his thoughts clouded with the uncertainty of what to do next. He could wait it out, hope that the storm would pass by morning, but something told him that wasn't the best plan. No one could predict how long the storm would last, and in the mountains, waiting could be a death sentence. The cold alone was enough to kill a man if he wasn't careful. The Rottweiler stirred at his movement, its sharp eyes watching Jackson with a quiet intelligence. The dog stood up and padded over to the door, nudging it with its nose. Jackson watched curiously, wondering what the dog wanted. Was it trying to tell him something? Was it trying to lead him somewhere? For a moment Jackson hesitated, unsure of whether he should follow the dog's lead. But the dog's persistence convinced him. With a sigh, he grabbed his jacket and gloves, putting them on. He wasn't sure what the dog had in mind, but it had led him to safety before, and perhaps it could do the same now. As he stepped outside, the biting wind hit him like a slap in the face. The cold was immediate and unforgiving, the snow swirling around him like a blinding fog. The Rottweiler was already a few paces ahead, moving through the snow with the ease and confidence of an animal born to these harsh conditions. Jackson followed, stumbling over the deep snow, struggling to keep up. The storm was deafening out here. The wind howled in his ears, drowning out any sounds other than the rush of the storm. But the dog was unfazed, its head low, its body cutting through the snow as if it knew exactly where it was going. Jackson's thoughts raced as he followed the dog. He had to make it out of the storm. He couldn't stay here forever, trapped in the mountains. The cabin, as comforting as it had been, was only a temporary refuge. The real challenge lay ahead, beyond the snowstorm, beyond the wilderness. He had to trust the dog. Minutes passed, maybe even an hour, as they trudged through the deep snow. Jackson's body was protesting, his muscles burning from the cold, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The dog was still ahead of him, its movements steady and deliberate, as though it had walked this path 1,000 times before. Just when Jackson was beginning to doubt whether they were heading in the right direction, the dog stopped. It turned and looked at him, its eyes glowing with a mix of urgency and determination. Jackson felt his heart race. Was it time to turn back? Had they reached a dead end? Then, without warning, the dog darted forward, racing ahead with a burst of energy that Jackson could barely keep up with. He sprinted after it, his legs sinking deeper into the snow with each step, his heart pounding. The dog led him through the snowstorm, its sleek black coat barely visible against the white backdrop. But Jackson could just make out its shape ahead, of him, guiding him through the chaos of the storm. Suddenly the snow ahead of them shifted. Jackson's foot slipped, and he found himself tumbling forward, landing hard on his chest. For a moment he thought he had lost the dog, but then through the blizzard he saw it again, standing at the edge of a cliff, its body tense, tail held high. The dog barked sharply, a sound that was swallowed by the wind, but its stance told Jackson everything he needed to know. They had reached the edge. The ground beneath his feet was unstable, the snow threatening to give way with every step. Jackson could feel his heart racing, the fear creeping up his spine as the reality of their situation hit him. They were on the edge of a steep cliff, the drop below shrouded by the swirling snow. There was no way back. Where do we go now? Jackson muttered to himself, panic creeping into his voice. The Rottweiler turned, looking back at Jackson with eyes that seemed to say, "Follow me." Without hesitation, the dog bounded forward, jumping over the edge of the cliff with a fluid, graceful leap that left Jackson breathless. For a moment, Jackson stood frozen, his mind racing with disbelief. Had the dog just jumped off the cliff? His heart skipped a beat, but the sound of the dog's bark echoed from below, a reassuring signal that the Rottweiler had landed safely. It was as if the dog had known the path all along, navigating the treacherous terrain with an instinct Jackson couldn't comprehend. With no other choice, Jackson took a deep breath and followed. He jumped, his legs kicking through the snow as he made the leap. The world seemed to hold its breath as he fell, the wind whipping past his face. Then he landed, hard, his knees buckling beneath him as he tumbled into a soft snowbank. For a moment everything went black. When Jackson regained his senses, he was lying in the snow, dazed but unharmed. The Rottweiler was standing nearby, waiting for him to recover. Its eyes were calm, its posture steady, as though nothing had happened at all. Jackson pulled himself to his feet, his body sore but intact. He looked around, trying to make sense of where he was. The landscape had changed. The cliff was no longer behind them, and the storm seemed to have cleared, the snow now falling in gentle flakes. The dog barked again, its attention focused ahead. Jackson followed the dog's gaze and saw it. A distant figure, barely visible, through the clearing snow. A person. A human. Hope surged within him. There was a chance, after all. The storm hadn't won. They weren't alone. The figure ahead was still a blur, barely visible through the mist of swirling snow. Jackson's breath came in sharp, freezing bursts, and for a moment he wondered if his mind was playing tricks on him. Could there really be someone else out here in the middle of the storm? Or was this just another hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the cold? But the Rottweiler didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, it bounded forward, its powerful legs eating up the distance between them and the figure in mere moments. Jackson, still unsure of what he was seeing, followed the dog, his legs burning with the effort. Each step felt like wading through thick molasses as the snow pulled at his boots, making each movement sluggish and heavy. The figure was clearer now, more than just a shape in the distance, but a man, standing tall and unmoving, dressed in a dark coat that seemed to blend into the snowstorm. The man didn't seem to notice Jackson's approach, but the dog was already there, barking sharply at the stranger. "Hey," Jackson called out, trying to get the man's attention. His voice was barely audible over the howling wind, but the stranger turned toward him, his face partly obscured by a scarf, his eyes narrow and focused. For a long moment they just stood there, staring at each other, the blizzard swirling around them like an impenetrable wall. The man's gaze was intense, almost unreadable, and Jackson felt a sudden twinge of uncertainty. Was this person a rescuer, or someone just as lost as he was? The Rottweiler continued barking, stepping closer to the stranger as if urging him to act. The man seemed unfazed by the dog's persistence, though Jackson noticed his posture, tense, alert, but not hostile. It was as if he was sizing Jackson up, assessing whether he posed a threat. The dog, however, had no such reservations. It continued to nudge the man's leg with its nose, as though trying to get him to make a move. "Do you need help?" Jackson asked again, this time louder, though his voice still strained under the weight of the storm. The man finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "What's your name?" The question threw Jackson off balance for a second. It wasn't the kind of response he had expected in such a situation, but the man's tone was direct, as though there was no time for pleasantries. "Jackson," he replied, his breath visible in the air, hanging between them like a cloud of smoke. "What about you? Are you out here alone?" The stranger nodded, his eyes scanning the distance behind Jackson. "I was. But now it seems we're not alone, are we?" Jackson couldn't help but glance over his shoulder, but the dog was already leading them in the opposite direction, as though it had made its decision. The Rottweiler paused, looking back over its shoulder at Jackson, and then barked again, an urgent, demanding sound that cut through the noise of the wind. Jackson followed the dog's lead without question. The man followed them, his steps light and careful in the deep snow, but his gait was determined, and Jackson couldn't help but notice how at ease he seemed in this harsh environment. The man moved with purpose, his eyes scanning their surroundings with the sharpness of someone who had lived here, who understood the land and its dangers. The Rottweiler led them steadily through the snow, pushing forward as though it knew exactly where they were headed. Jackson, still unsure of the man, had 100 questions running through his mind, but he kept them to himself. Now wasn't the time for curiosity or suspicion. Survival was the only thing that mattered. After a few more minutes of trudging through the snow, the man spoke again. "I was tracking something, a wild animal, a bear maybe." His voice was steady, but there was a strange edge to it, a hint of tension that Jackson couldn't quite place. "The storm caught me off guard. It's not usually this bad this time of..." Yeah, what about you? How did you end up out here? Jackson hesitated, considering how much to share. He didn't know this man, and yet there was something about him, something in the way he moved, in the way he interacted with the world, that made Jackson feel a strange sense of trust. The storm had changed everything, and in this bleak, isolated place, survival came before everything else. I got lost, Jackson admitted. The storm rolled in too fast. I couldn't find my way back. Thought I was done for until... He paused, glancing down at the Rottweiler, whose head was held high, alert and focused on the path ahead. Until this dog showed up. The man gave a knowing nod, his lips curling into a small, tight smile. Dogs have a way of doing that, don't they? Jackson couldn't help but return the smile, though it felt strained in the face of the storm. I didn't think it would make it out here, he admitted. It's incredible, really. The way it found me in the storm, almost like it knew where I was. The stranger looked down at the Rottweiler, his gaze softening for a moment. They're smarter than people give them credit for. A lot of animals are. Jackson wondered if there was a deeper meaning behind the man's words. He couldn't quite place it, but something about the stranger's demeanor felt off, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made Jackson feel like he was being watched, like the man wasn't just guiding them through the storm, he was studying them, sizing them up. The dog barked again, bringing Jackson's attention back to the present. They had reached a small clearing in the woods, where the snow seemed to thin out a little. The trees around them were heavy with snow, their branches sagging under the weight of the storm. But here, at least, the wind wasn't as fierce. The Rottweiler stopped in the center of the clearing, its eyes scanning the surroundings as though it had reached its destination. Jackson looked around, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There was no sign of civilization, no shelter, nothing that indicated they were close to safety. All he could see were trees and snow, stretching out in every direction. "Is this where we're headed?" Jackson asked, turning to the stranger. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved closer to the Rottweiler, bending down to examine something in the snow. Jackson followed. Curiosity piqued. The man's hand brushed away the snow to reveal something dark beneath it, a bundle of fur. Jackson's stomach churned, realizing what it was. A body. The stranger stood up slowly, his eyes narrowed. "This isn't just any storm," he muttered under his breath, his voice filled with a grim tone that made the hairs on the back of Jackson's neck stand on end. "This is a warning." The Rottweiler stood guard, its body tense, alert to the growing danger. Jackson could feel the shift in the air, an unspoken understanding passing between him and the dog. Something was wrong. This was no ordinary rescue, and they were far from safe. In this section, the story shifts from survival to a deeper sense of mystery, introducing the enigmatic stranger who may not be what he seems. Jackson's growing trust in the Rottweiler contrasts with his increasing uncertainty about the man's true intentions, setting the stage for tension and the escalation of their shared ordeal. The discovery of a body buried in the snow adds a dark layer to their situation, hinting at dangers that go beyond just the storm. The world around them seemed to close in as the storm intensified, the snow now falling in thick, almost impenetrable sheets. The wind howled like an angry beast, its fury enough to make even the toughest of men falter. Jackson could barely see a few feet ahead of him, but the Rottweiler led the way with an uncanny determination, its body cutting through the snow like a force of nature itself. The stranger, though quiet and stoic, moved with a fluidity that betrayed a deep knowledge of the land. His steps were confident, measured, like someone who had spent years battling the harshest elements and had learned to read the signs of nature. Jackson, on the other hand, was struggling to keep up. His body aching with the effort, his breath ragged and shallow. Every step felt like a battle, the snow pulling at his boots, threatening to swallow him whole. His body was on fire with exhaustion, but the fear of what might be lurking out there, what might be waiting for them, kept him moving. The man's words from earlier echoed in his mind. This is a warning. A warning about what? What did he mean? But Jackson didn't have the luxury of answers. All he could do was follow the dog and the stranger through the storm, hoping that wherever they were headed, it would offer a semblance of safety. And then the first sign came, a low growl, distant but unmistakable. carried on the wind. Jackson froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The Rottweiler, usually so steady and calm, had its ears pricked up, its eyes scanning the horizon with a newfound intensity. It stopped abruptly, its body tensing as if it had detected something just beyond the veil of the storm. The stranger, too, halted. He didn't speak, but Jackson could see the muscles in his back tighten. There was a shift in the air, a sense of foreboding that made every inch of Jackson's skin crawl. "Stay close," the man finally said, his voice low and urgent. "It's not just the storm we have to worry about." Before Jackson could ask what he meant, the growl came again, louder this time. It wasn't just one growl, it was multiple. A chorus of low, rumbling sounds that reverberated through the snow, carrying a sense of menace that sent a chill deeper than the cold itself. The Rottweiler moved closer to Jackson, positioning itself between him and the sound. Its stance was protective, its growls now a warning to whatever was out there. Jackson instinctively reached for the small knife he kept in his pocket, though he knew it would be little match against whatever was out there. The snowstorm made it impossible to see, but the growls were growing closer, more insistent. "Stay calm," the stranger said, his voice barely audible over the noise of the wind. "Whatever it is, it's not the first time I've faced it." Jackson's mind raced, the fear creeping in with each passing second. "What are we dealing with?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around, his eyes scanning the whiteout conditions with unnerving focus. "We've got a pack on our hands," he said finally. "Wolves." Jackson's heart sank. Wolves were one thing. A pack of them, though, that was something else entirely. The Rottweiler's growls grew louder, more forceful, but it still didn't move forward. It was as though it knew they needed a plan, not just brute strength, and then, as if on cue, the first wolf emerged from the storm. Its fur was a pale grey, its eyes glowing in the dim light, almost as if they had their own fire burning within them. Its movements were fluid, graceful, an apex predator, confident in its hunting grounds. Jackson could barely make it out against the backdrop of swirling snow, but he saw enough to know it was big, larger than any dog he had seen before. It was a wolf, and it was sizing them up. More followed, their silhouettes emerging from the blizzard one after another, each wolf a perfect embodiment of nature's brutality. There were at least 5 of them, maybe more, their eyes gleaming, with hunger and curiosity. They moved slowly at first, circling the group like a predator testing the waters, assessing the threat level. The Rottweiler, still positioned between Jackson and the stranger, let out a low, menacing growl, but it didn't charge. It knew better. It knew that the wolves were in control here, at least for now. "Stay calm," the stranger repeated, though Jackson could see the tension in his face now, the way his hand rested on the hilt of a knife. The wolves were closing in, and he didn't seem quite as confident as before. Jackson could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His mind raced for a solution, but the only thing he knew for sure was that they were outnumbered. The wolves were closing in, their eyes never leaving them, and he could hear the crunch of their paws in the snow, their movements synchronized, almost like a well-oiled machine. Suddenly, the lead wolf lunged forward, its teeth bared, its body a blur of motion. The Rottweiler reacted instantly, its muscles coiling and releasing with the speed of a striking snake. The two collided with a deafening thud, the sound of claws and teeth snapping echoing through the storm. Jackson barely had time to process what was happening before the other wolves attacked, their growls filling the air as they pounced. The stranger moved into action just as quickly, pulling out his own weapon, though Jackson didn't have the time to see what it was. He was focused solely on the Rottweiler, which was locked in a fierce battle with the alpha wolf. The fight was brutal, a whirlwind of fur, claws, and snapping jaws. Jackson could see the strength in the dog's movements, its sheer power and agility, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the pack overwhelmed them. "Get back!" the stranger shouted, pushing Jackson out of the way. "We need to move!" Now Jackson didn't question it. The Rottweiler and the stranger were holding their own, but he could see that the pack was getting more aggressive, more coordinated with each passing second. They couldn't win this fight. Not here, not now. The stranger grabbed Jackson's arm, pulling him with surprising strength as they backed away, making their way through the thick snow. But the wolves didn't relent. They pursued, a pack of relentless predators, hungry and determined. Jackson could hear their snarls behind them, feel the tension rising with each step. But then something happened. The Rottweiler, sensing the change in the air, made a split-second decision. It broke off from the fight, racing towards Jackson and the stranger. With a low growl, it positioned itself between them and the wolves, its eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "Go!" the stranger shouted again, urgency in his voice now. "We can't stay here!" Jackson hesitated, torn between the loyalty he felt for the dog and the reality that they needed to survive. But the Rottweiler's gaze was unwavering, focused on the pack closing in from behind. With a final glance, Jackson turned and ran, the snow swallowing their footsteps as the Rottweiler held the wolves at bay. The world blurred into a frenzy of white as they sprinted forward, the howls of the wolves growing fainter with every step. But Jackson knew it wasn't over. The danger wasn't behind them, it was all around them. And survival wasn't just about running. It was about outsmarting the storm, the wolves, and whatever else lay in wait. As Jackson and the stranger pushed through the storm, their path now uncertain, the harsh wind carrying the scent of wolves behind them, something unexpected occurred. It wasn't just the wilderness that had brought them here. The stranger's presence was a mystery, his silent demeanor concealing a story of its own, a past that had been shaped by more than just survival against nature's fury. Jackson had noticed the way the man had been watching him, studying him, in a way that made him feel uncomfortable at times. But it wasn't until they had reached a small makeshift shelter, built from fallen branches and thick snow-covered logs, that the truth began to surface. As they huddled inside, seeking refuge from the biting cold and waiting for the storm to pass, the stranger finally spoke again. His voice was gruff, laden with the weight of unspoken years, but there was a raw honesty to it. "We're not just here because of the storm, you know," the man began, his gaze distant as though speaking to himself more than to Jackson. "There's more to this than you think." Jackson was taken aback. He had been so focused on surviving the wolves, on the constant need to keep moving, that he had forgotten to question how they had ended up here together, why they were in this deadly landscape in the first place. "What do you mean?" Jackson asked, his voice quieter than he intended. The stranger gave a half nod, his eyes flicking to the Rottweiler, which had curled up in the corner, its body tense, but its eyes alert. The dog was still on high alert, as though ready to spring into action at any moment. "It's not just the wilderness trying to kill us, it's what's out there, beyond the storm. I've been running from it for a long time." Jackson didn't know what to say. The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. The man's cryptic statement only added to the mounting tension. What was he running from? And why had he chosen to reveal this to Jackson, a complete stranger in a moment of crisis? But before he could ask, the man continued, his voice barely audible above the sound of the wind howling outside. "There's a reason the wolves are so aggressive. They're not just hunting for food." The man paused, taking a deep breath, as though he was about to reveal something he had kept hidden for far too long. "They're hunting me." Jackson stared at the stranger, his heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean, wolves don't target people unless there's a reason?" The man's gaze hardened, his jaw clenching as he looked at Jackson with something between regret and anger. "They don't just target anyone. They're part of something bigger." A cold shiver ran down Jackson's spine as he processed the stranger's words. He opened his mouth to ask more questions, but the stranger held up a hand, signaling him to stay quiet. "You don't want to know the full story," the man muttered, his voice taking on a bitter edge. "But if you want to survive this, you need to understand something. The wolves, they're just the beginning. There's something much darker at work." The wind outside screamed as if in agreement, the storm a reminder of the danger that surrounded them. Jackson felt a weight in the air, an energy that shifted between him and the stranger. They were no longer just two men stranded in a snowstorm. There was something deeper, something rooted in the past, something that had tied their fates together in this frozen hellscape. "I didn't ask for any of this," the stranger continued, his voice breaking with emotion. "I never wanted any of this, but they're after me, after something I've got." Jackson's mind raced, the questions piling up faster than he could process them. Who was this man? Why were the wolves targeting him? What was he carrying that was worth so much? "I don't understand," Jackson said, his voice strained. "Why are you telling me this now? What's the point?" The stranger's eyes darkened, and for a moment the hardness in his gaze faltered. He looked away, as if battling some inner turmoil before he finally spoke again. "There's no way out of this," he said softly, "but I owe it to you, to the dog, to tell you. The wolves, they're being controlled, not by nature, by something else. Something that knows how to manipulate the pack, how to turn them into weapons. And it's not just wolves they control." Jackson felt a chill in his bones. What was the man saying? This sounded like something out of a nightmare. "Who's controlling? Them?" Jackson demanded. "And what do you have to do with it?" The stranger's face hardened again, and he looked at the Rottweiler for a long moment before answering. "It's not just about wolves, Jackson. There's something bigger, something dangerous, and I've been running from it for years." The silence between them stretched on, thick and heavy, as Jackson tried to absorb everything the stranger had said. But before he could say anything more, the Rottweiler stirred, its ears flicking at the slightest sound. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. Something was out there. The man stood up, grabbing his pack and the knife that hung at his side. His face had taken on a grim expression, the once calm demeanor replaced by a sharp, alert intensity. "The storm isn't the only threat," he said, his voice taut with urgency. "Stay close, it's coming." Jackson could hear it now, a sound just beyond the reach of the storm, a low growl, distant, but growing closer with every passing second. The Rottweiler was already on its feet, its body taut, eyes scanning the blizzard with a fierceness Jackson had never seen before. It was ready to fight, to protect. And Jackson could feel it too, the weight of the impending danger. The stranger motioned for Jackson to follow, his movements swift and sure. "We don't have much time. Stay close and don't let your guard down. They're close, too close." As they exited the shelter, the blizzard had become even more ferocious, the wind biting at their exposed skin. Jackson's breath came in sharp bursts as the storm seemed to close in around them. But the Rottweiler led the way, its keen senses picking up on something Jackson couldn't yet see. The stranger moved with purpose, his steps sure despite the treacherous footing. Jackson followed closely, trying to push aside the fear that gnawed at his insides. The stranger's words replayed in his mind, each one adding weight to the already heavy atmosphere. This wasn't just about surviving the storm. This wasn't just about wolves. There was something more, something dangerous, and they were about to face it head-on. As they trudged through the snow, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was waiting just beyond the reach of the storm, ready to strike. And the Rottweiler? Jackson wasn't sure if it was sensing the same thing, but he could tell that it was just as prepared as the stranger. They were a team bound by something deeper than survival. In this moment, Jackson understood. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The howl of the wind grew louder as Jackson, the stranger, and the Rottweiler pressed on through the storm. The sense of being watched was no longer just a fleeting feeling. Jackson could hear it now, the sound of something large, something hunting. It wasn't the wind or the blizzard. It was a low, guttural growl that sent chills down his spine. The wolves were closer, but they weren't the only threat. As the trio advanced through the snow-covered landscape, the stranger's face remained taut with concentration. His jaw was clenched, his eyes darting constantly, scanning the swirling whiteness for any sign of movement. He moved with urgency, but Jackson could see the exhaustion weighing on him. Despite his rugged exterior, the stranger was running on, fumes pushing forward through sheer willpower. "Stay close," the stranger barked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "They'll come from all directions. We can't let them surround us." Jackson nodded, tightening his grip on his coat and trying to ignore the frostbite biting at his fingers. The Rottweiler stayed by his side, its body tense, every muscle coiled, its senses tuned to the shifting danger around them. Jackson had never seen an animal so in tune with its surroundings. The dog was a warrior, and he could feel it in the way it moved, every step purposeful, every sound processed. As they trudged on, Jackson's mind raced. He had thought the storm was the real enemy, but now he knew it wasn't just the elements they had to worry about. The wolves, the dark force controlling them, were only a part of something much bigger, and the stranger knew it. There was a history here, a secret tied to the forest, the wolves, and the storm. Jackson had to know what it was. "Why are they after you?" Jackson asked, his voice cutting through the howling wind. The stranger's lips twisted in a grimace. He didn't answer immediately, but the pain in his eyes spoke volumes. Finally he spoke, his voice tinged with regret. "It's not just me they're after, it's a mistake," he said, his words thick with emotion. "I never meant for this to happen. I thought I could outrun it, but I can't. I've been running for too long." Before Jackson could ask more questions, the Rottweiler suddenly growled low, its ears perked, its body stiff with alertness. Jackson froze, his heart pounding in his chest. It was closer now. He could hear the soft crunch of snow underfoot, a shadow moving in the distance. The stranger's eyes narrowed and he drew a knife from his belt, holding it in front of him with practiced ease. "Get ready," he whispered, his voice steely. "They're here." Jackson swallowed hard. The Rottweiler's growls intensified, the sound vibrating in the air, its stance unwavering as it faced the direction of the approaching danger. Then, from the thickening blizzard, the first of the wolves appeared. Their eyes gleamed in the darkness, glowing amber like fire in the depths of a forest. There were at least 5, their massive bodies rippling beneath their fur, their movements fluid and silent. Jackson felt his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't just an ordinary pack of wolves, they were different, bigger, stronger, faster. They moved with a terrifying precision, as though they had been trained to hunt, to track, to kill. The stranger stepped forward, standing in front of Jackson and the Rottweiler. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice unwavering. Jackson's heart hammered in his chest as he clutched the snow-covered ground beneath his feet, but the Rottweiler was already in motion. Without a single command, the dog lunged forward, its powerful body surging through the snow with incredible speed. The lead wolf charged toward the Rottweiler, teeth bared, its eyes filled with predatory focus. Jackson held his breath, watching as the Rottweiler met the wolf head-on. The two animals collided with a violent force, the Rottweiler sinking its teeth into the wolf's neck with brutal precision. There was no hesitation, no fear in the dog's eyes, only the instinct to protect, to survive. The wolves were attacking with synchronized fury, but the Rottweiler fought with equal determination, using every ounce of its strength and training. Jackson could only watch in awe as the dog battled, its movements fluid and deadly, its jaws snapping with deadly accuracy. The stranger stood beside Jackson, the knife glinting in his hand, ready to strike if the wolves came any closer. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but there was a flicker of something else, fear. He was terrified, but not for himself. He was afraid of what would happen if the wolves reached Jackson. If the wolves were after him, they were also after Jackson, for reasons he hadn't yet revealed. Suddenly a loud crack echoed through the air. Jackson's eyes widened as one of the wolves lunged toward him, its jaws snapping with terrifying force. The Rottweiler was quick, intercepting the wolf mid-air and slamming it to the ground, its teeth sinking into the beast's side with unrelenting force. The stranger's hand shot out, pulling Jackson behind him, out of the way of the battle. The two men watched as the Rottweiler fought, its body moving with an elegance that belied its raw power. Then, in a flash, the Rottweiler leapt into the air, its jaws closing around the neck of the largest wolf, and with a final crushing twist, the beast fell limp, its body going still. For a moment everything went silent. The snow continued to fall, the storm howling through the trees, but the wolves were no longer a threat. The Rottweiler stood over the body of the largest wolf, panting heavily, its eyes scanning the surrounding area for any remaining danger. Jackson let out a shaky breath, his legs trembling from the adrenaline. He turned to the stranger, who was also staring at the Rottweiler with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "It's over," the stranger said, his voice low, "but we're not safe yet." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What happens now?" The stranger's gaze darkened, and he glanced toward the horizon, where the storm was starting to clear. "There's more to this than just wolves. We've faced the first wave, but the real danger is still out there. The forces controlling these wolves, they're still watching us, and they won't stop until they get what they want." Jackson felt his stomach drop. "What do they want?" The stranger didn't answer right away, his face hardening with resolve. "I don't know, but I'll make sure they don't get it." With the wolves defeated for the moment, the trio moved cautiously through the clearing, each step bringing them closer to whatever awaited them. The storm had begun to subside, the wind dying down, but a new sense of urgency filled the air. They weren't out of danger yet. The fight for survival was far from over. As they disappeared into the forest, their destination unclear, Jackson knew one thing for sure. Whatever the stranger's past held, whatever secrets he was hiding, Jackson was now part of it. And together, they would face whatever came next, side by side, as the storm raged on in the distance. As the last remnants of the storm faded, the moon broke free from behind the clouds, casting a silver glow over the landscape. The snow, now, softened by the retreating winds, gleamed under the pale light, reflecting the quiet aftermath of the battle. Jackson, the stranger, and the Rottweiler walked slowly through the forest, their breaths shallow but steady in the cold night air. The threat of the wolves had passed, but the weight of what they had just endured lingered between them like a silent question. The stranger, still holding his knife loosely in his hand, broke the silence. "We should be close to the cabin now. We can rest there." Jackson nodded, his mind racing. They had fought for their lives, but something else was gnawing at him. Something deeper, something he couldn't quite grasp. The stranger's words had echoed in his mind. The real danger is still out there. What did that mean? Who or what was controlling the wolves? Why had they come after them, and what did the stranger know that he wasn't telling? As if sensing his unease, the Rottweiler walked closer to him, its large form acting as a comforting presence in the otherwise desolate landscape. Jackson bent down, running his fingers through the dog's thick coat, feeling the warmth of its body against the bitter cold. The bond between them had grown stronger during the fight. There was a connection now, something unspoken but undeniable. In the darkest moments, when death had seemed imminent, the Rottweiler had been his protector, his savior. "Thank you," Jackson murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The Rottweiler's amber eyes met his, the gaze unwavering, as if understanding. The depth of Jackson's gratitude. The dog had saved him not just from physical harm, but from something deeper, something Jackson had never fully understood until that very moment. The animal had acted out of pure instinct, but there was something profoundly human in its actions. It wasn't just a dog. It was a friend, a companion, a guardian. As they approached the small cabin nestled between the trees, the stranger turned to Jackson, his face softened by the faint light of the moon. "You did good back there," he said. "You fought with everything you had." Jackson offered a faint smile, though his mind was still clouded with questions. "What's your story? Why were the wolves after us, and who was controlling them?" The stranger's expression darkened, his eyes shifting toward the cabin as if seeking refuge from the weight of the question. He remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice heavy with regret. "They're not just wolves," he said slowly. "They're part of something much larger, something I've been running from for years. There's a group, a cult. They've been using the wolves to hunt anyone they consider a threat to their power. I was once part of it, one of them, but I broke free." Jackson blinked in surprise. "A cult? But why the wolves? Why this place?" The stranger sighed, rubbing his face as though the weight of his past was more than he could bear. "The wolves, they're not ordinary. They're trained, controlled by the leader of the cult, and this forest, it's been their base for centuries. It's where they keep their secrets, their power. The storm, it's a manifestation of their dark magic. They summoned it to keep us trapped, to hunt us down." Jackson's mind reeled. The world he had known, one of simple routines, clear paths, was now shattered by this new reality. The storm, the wolves, the cult, it was all connected in a way he couldn't fully understand. He glanced at the Rottweiler, still walking beside him, its eyes filled with unwavering loyalty. The animal had fought not just for survival, but to protect him, and in doing so had shown Jackson what true courage looked like. "What happens now?" Jackson asked, his voice quiet, almost defeated. The stranger stopped walking and turned to face him. "We keep moving. The cult won't stop until they get what they want, but we won't let them. You're part of this now, Jackson. They've marked you." A chill ran down Jackson's spine. He had never imagined something like this could happen. A cult, wolves controlled by dark forces, a storm as a weapon. His world had been upended. But despite the fear gnawing at him, there was a sense of resolve beginning to build inside him. He couldn't just run, not anymore. The stranger's words had made it clear. There was no going back. The Rottweiler, sensing Jackson's inner turmoil, nudged his hand, its warm breath a reminder that he wasn't alone. Jackson looked down at the dog, his mind made up. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it as an outsider. He would face it as part of something bigger, part of a bond that transcended fear and uncertainty. "I'm with you," Jackson said, his voice steady now. "We'll stop them." The stranger nodded, a glimmer of something like approval in his eyes. "Good. We'll need each other if we're going to make it out of this." They reached the cabin, and as the door creaked open, the warmth inside was a welcome relief from the biting cold of the storm. But the comfort was short-lived. The real battle had only just begun. As they sat around the small fire in the cabin, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that the storm outside wasn't the only force they had to contend with. The cult, the wolves, and the darkness controlling them were still out there, watching, waiting. But now Jackson wasn't just a traveler caught in a storm. He was part of something larger, something that demanded courage, sacrifice, and resilience. And with the Rottweiler by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. And for the first time since the storm had begun, Jackson felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the peace of safety or certainty, but the peace of knowing that he was no longer alone. He had found a purpose, a reason to keep fighting. The night stretched on, and the storm outside raged in the distance. But within the warmth of the cabin there was hope. Hope that even in the darkest of times, the light of friendship and loyalty could guide them through the storm. As Jackson sat by the fire, reflecting on all that had happened, he knew one thing for sure. The journey was far from over. But with the Rottweiler by his side, and the stranger's mysterious knowledge, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Together, they would confront the cult, uncover its secrets, and fight to protect the world they had always known. And in the end, they would emerge stronger for it, united by a bond that could not be broken no matter how dark the storm became. The story of survival and resilience would live on in their hearts, a testament to the power of trust, courage, and the unexpected bonds that can change everything.